James Brown was in the middle of Get Up Offer That Thing in Kinshasa, Zaire, when barefoot children started rushing the stage. Security moved to stop them, but James held up his hand. "Let them come," he said. Within seconds, 20 African children surrounded him on stage, and they started dancing. Not rehearsed moves, not choreographed steps, just pure, uninhibited joy. And then James Brown did something that stunned the 80,000 people watching. He stopped performing. He stepped back, and he let those children take over his show. For 20 minutes, the world watched barefoot kids from Kinshasa dance on James Brown's stage. And James stood to the side crying because in that moment he understood something he'd been searching for his whole life. He'd finally come home. September 1974. The world was watching Kinshasa, Zaire, which would later become the Democratic Republic of Congo. But they weren't watching because of music. They were watching because of a boxing match. Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman. The rumble in the jungle, the biggest sporting event in history, and it was happening in Africa. The promoter, Don King, wanted to make this more than just a fight. He wanted a cultural celebration, so he organized a music festival to accompany the bout. He called it Zaire 74, and he brought some of the biggest names in black music to perform. B.B. King, the Spinners, Miriam Makeba, and at the top of the bills, James Brown. James was 41 years old. He'd been performing for over 20 years. He'd played every major venue in America and Europe. He'd performed for presidents. He'd sold millions of records. But in all those years, all those stages, all those countries, James Brown had never set foot on African soil. This wasn't just another concert for him. This was something deeper, something he'd been thinking about his whole life. Where did the rhythm come from? Where did the music that lived in his bones originate? He knew his ancestors had been taken from Africa in chains. He knew the music he made, soul, funk, rhythm, and blues, had roots that crossed the ocean. But he'd never seen the place where it all began. When James's plane landed in Kinshasa on September 22, 1974, he didn't step off like a celebrity arriving for a gig. He stepped off like a man approaching something sacred. The heat hit him immediately. Thick, humid, the kind of heat that makes you feel the air in your lungs. The sun was different here, brighter, closer. But what struck James most wasn't the weather, it was the people waiting at the airport. Hundreds of them, families, children sitting on their fathers' shoulders, women in colorful fabrics, men standing tall with quiet pride. And when they saw James, they didn't scream like American fans. They didn't rush him for autographs. They smiled, they nodded, and some of them whispered words James didn't understand, but felt in his chest. Welcome home. The children were the first to approach. Their feet were bare, dusty from the unpaved roads around the airport. They weren't shy or hesitant. They walked right up to James and looked at him with wide eyes, not with awe at a celebrity, but with recognition, like they knew him, like he was family who'd been gone too long. James knelt down to meet them at eye level. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, reached out and touched his hair. She giggled. James smiled. "Hi, baby," he said softly. The girl didn't speak English, but she understood the tone. She wrapped her small arms around his neck and hugged him. James's crew watched this interaction, cameras rolling, but they knew they weren't capturing a photo op. They were witnessing something real. James wasn't performing. This was honest. Over the next 2 days before the concert, James did something unusual for a star of his caliber. He didn't stay locked in a hotel suite. He didn't isolate himself to prepare. Instead, he went into the neighborhoods. He visited families in their homes. He sat on the ground with elders under trees and listened to them talk, even when he couldn't understand the language. He watched children play in the streets, their games accompanied by rhythms they clapped with their hands and stomped with their feet. And everywhere James went, he saw it. The rhythm, the same rhythm that lived in him, the same movements he thought he'd created in Augusta, Georgia. The way the children moved their hips, the way they shuffled their feet, the way they dropped to the ground and popped back up. These weren't moves they'd learned from American television. Most of these kids had never seen a TV. This was something older, something that had been here all along. September 24th, 1974. The concert. The stadium held 80,000 people, and every seat was filled. The energy was different from any crowd James had ever felt. American audiences screamed and danced, but there was a performance to it, a kind of transaction. You paid for a ticket, you got entertainment. But this crowd felt different. They weren't there as customers. They were there as family welcoming someone home. James took the stage wearing a patterned African shirt, not his usual sequined American jumpsuit. He wanted to show respect, to show he understood where he was. When he grabbed the microphone and the band kicked into Get On Up, the crowd erupted. But it wasn't just noise, it was recognition. These people knew his music. His records had made it here, played on scratchy radios and borrowed record players. But more than knowing the songs, they felt them, because the rhythm wasn't foreign to them, it was theirs. James performed for about 40 minutes, working through his hits. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, I Got You, Sex Machine. The crowd was on their feet, dancing, singing along even when they didn't know all the words. And down in front, pressed against the stage barriers, were the children. Dozens of them. Their faces were lit with joy, so pure it looked like light. Then James launched into Get Up Off of That Thing. The horns blasted, the drums pounded, and something spontaneous happened. The children at the front couldn't contain themselves anymore. They started climbing over the barriers, past the security guards, onto the stage. At first, security reacted the way they were trained. They moved to intercept, to grab the kids and pull them back. This was a professional concert. You can't have random people rushing the stage. But James saw them coming. He saw the panic in the security guards' eyes, and he saw the joy in the children's faces. James held up his hand, the same commanding gesture he used to cue his band. "Let them come," he said firmly, into the microphone. The security guards froze. "Let them come," James repeated, smiling now. And they came. 5 children, then 10, then 15, then 20. Barefoot kids ranging from about 6 years old to maybe 12. They surrounded James on that stage, and without any prompting, without any direction, they started dancing. Not copying James's moves, dancing their own way, spinning, kicking up their feet, dropping low and popping back up. Their arms were loose. Their faces were lit with pure, unfiltered happiness. Some of them tried to imitate James's famous footwork and stumbled, laughing when they fell. Others danced in ways that looked ancient, movements that felt like they'd been passed down through generations. The crowd of 80,000 went from loud to silent in seconds, not because they were upset, but because they were witnessing something unexpected, something sacred. And then James Brown did something that nobody saw coming. He stopped performing. Mid-song, the band kept playing, following his lead, as always. But James stepped back. He moved to the side of the stage and just watched. 20 African children took over the Godfather of Soul's stage, and James Brown became the audience. For 20 minutes, Those kids danced. The band adapted, playing rhythms that matched the children's movements. The horns would punctuate a spin. The drums would emphasize a drop. It became a conversation, not rehearsed, not planned, but real. The musicians were following the children, and the children were following something older than any of them. James stood to the side, clapping in rhythm, smiling, nodding. But tears were streaming down his face. His band noticed. His crew noticed. The crowd noticed. The godfather of soul, the hardest working man in show business, the man who never showed weakness on stage, was crying. Because in that moment, James understood something he'd been searching for his entire life. He'd spent 4 decades thinking he was creating something new, thinking he was inventing a sound, pioneering a style, building something from nothing. But watching these children, who'd never been to America, never studied choreography, never trained in any formal way, move with the same rhythm that lived in him, James realized the truth. He hadn't created anything. He'd remembered it. The rhythm had always been here. It had survived the slave ships. It had survived the chains and the fields and the centuries of oppression. It had hidden itself in work songs and church hymns and field hollers, and it had lived in him, carried through blood and bone, waiting to be recognized. These children weren't learning from James Brown. They were showing him where he came from when the 20 minutes ended, not because anyone called time, but because the children naturally wound down, exhausted and happy. James walked back to center stage. The stadium was still silent. 80,000 people holding their breath. James knelt down on that stage, not as part of a routine, not as a performance move. He knelt on African soil, surrounded by these barefoot children, and he bowed his head. The crowd understood. They erupted, not with screams but with a sound that was deeper. A collective release, like 80,000 people exhaling something they'd been holding for generations. After the show, James didn't rush to a hotel. He didn't retreat to air conditioning and luxury. He stayed. The families who'd brought their children to the concert came up to him, not pushing, not demanding, just approaching with quiet respect. And James sat with them, right there on the ground outside the stadium. No barriers, no security pushing people away. A small boy approached, holding something, a carved wooden drum, no bigger than a coffee can, handmade, simple. The boy held it out to James with both hands. James accepted it the same way, with both hands bowing his head in thanks. He didn't hand it to his manager to deal with. He held on to it. Later, that drum would sit in James' home for the rest of his life. Families shared food with James, cassava, grilled fish, maize cooked over open fires. Not fancy, not restaurant food, just real life. James sat cross-legged, eating with his hands the way they did, laughing when he struggled with the technique. The children showed him how, giggling when he got it wrong, celebrating when he got it right. An elder man, probably in his 70s, approached James. He didn't speak English, but through a translator, he said something James never forgot. "We knew you would come back. We've been waiting." James asked, "Waiting for me specifically?" The translator shook his head, spoke to the elder, then turned back to James. "Not you specifically. Any of the sons who were taken. We knew someday someone would remember the way home." That night, back in his room, James couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment those children climbed onto the stage, kept seeing their faces, kept feeling the rhythm in their movements. And he understood that every stage he'd ever stood on, every record he'd ever made, every performance he'd ever given. They'd all been leading to this. This was the show that mattered, not because 80,000 people saw it, but because those 20 children showed him who he was. In interviews after returning to America, reporters asked James about the Africa trip. They wanted to know about the crowds, the staging, the logistics, but James kept talking about the children. They weren't performing, he'd say. They were just being. They were joy without pretense, without trying to impress anyone. And that's what music is supposed to be. That's what I'd forgotten somewhere along the way, with the fame and the business and the pressure. Those kids reminded me that the rhythm isn't something you create. It's something you surrender to. It's something that already lives in you. A journalist once asked, "Did you teach them anything while you were there?" James smiled. "Teach them? Man, they taught me. They taught me where I came from. They taught me that I'm not special because I invented something. I'm blessed because I remembered something." There's a difference. The footage of those 20 minutes, James stepping back while barefoot African children danced on his stage, became one of the most powerful images of the 1970s. Not because it was entertaining, but because it was truth. It showed what happens when the diaspora meets its source, when descendants find their way back, even briefly, to the rhythm that was never really lost. Those children grew up. They had their own children, and they told the story. James Brown came to Kinshasa in 1974, and he let us dance on his stage. He didn't treat us like props or background or cute additions. He stepped aside and gave us his spotlight. And that taught us that greatness isn't about standing above others. It's about recognizing the greatness in others. James Brown lived another 32 years after that trip to Kinshasa. He performed thousands more shows. He made more records. He influenced entire generations of artists. But when people who knew him well were asked about the moments that defined him, many of them mentioned Kinshasa. Not the biggest crowd he ever played, not the most famous venue, but the stage he gave away to 20 barefoot children who showed him the rhythm had always been home. If this story of connection, humility, and finding where you come from moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that we're all connected to something bigger than ourselves, and that greatness means lifting others up. Have you ever had a moment where you felt like you'd come home? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments when legends discovered what really mattered.